Hi, everyone. I'm Elizabeth Petrino, and I teach at Fairfield University in Connecticut. As president of EDIS and on behalf of the board, I'm really pleased to welcome you to our EDIS panels for the ALA conference. Renée Bergland and Li-hsin, who serve on our board, have organized these really extraordinary papers. Like our international society, these speakers represent the variety and depth of the scholarship being done in Dickinson studies today. And I'd like to share my screen to tell you more. The first panel, Dickinson and Greenness, explores Dickinson's work by raising our awareness of the ways that her poetry connects with the human and global issues of our day. Ranging from the pedagogical, with Barbara Mossberg's insights into Dickinson's experiment in green, to the poetic and deeply personal, as in Gillian Osborne's discussion, in which she examines Dickinson's connection with nature through a network of contemporary poets who share her deep kinship with the non-human world. These papers place Dickinson in relation to many issues, texts and contexts, local and global, human and non-human, individual and community, science and religion. Surprising us into an awareness of their complexity, Karen Anderson's paper on fungi traces how the scale shifting and rapid growth of mushrooms allow Dickinson to reframe human subjectivity in terms of non-human life. In similar ways, Renée Bergland raises our awareness of Dickinson's work at the intersection of science and emotion through her perceptive and informative readings. In her investigation of the eco-Gothic, Li-hsin describes an unsettling fear associated with nature to create an alternate ecological and non-human centered view of the world. Taken together, these papers, which benefited from sustained dialogue among the authors, also suggest how our joining readings and conversation through digital modes of communication allow us to see connections in new interrelated ways. The second panel, Dickinson in Her and Our Time, situates Dickinson in the context of the national and the global, philosophy, landscape, religion, music, and the arts. These papers suggest both her affiliation with the writers and artists of her era and her continuing importance to our historical moment. As Mousumi Banerjee describes, the Kantian resonances of Dickinson's poetry demonstrate her deep philosophical orientation. Religion and music, in the papers of Amy Crawford and Gerard Holmes, provide a means to investigate the ways Dickinson, as a Calvinist Christian and a well-trained musician, used doctrinal or musical form to signal her departure from traditional thinking and poetic form. Drawing inspiration about Dickinson from recent Twitter accounts, Micah Bateman explores the way her use of hope exemplifies her understanding that in her time, as in our own, her poem might have been used to convey a naive sense of optimism and comfort she herself questioned. And Christa Holm Vogelius reads Dickinson against the Hudson River School artists, placing her within a framework of nationalist discourse that extolled America, while at the same time emphasizing her global and planetary, to borrow a phrase from Renée Bergland, outlook. I hope you will enjoy these recordings as much as I did. If you do, I encourage you to join as a member of EDIS. As a result of the pandemic, EDIS held in 2020 its first successful online conference, Dickinson at a Distance, and we plan to offer another virtual annual meeting this August on Dickinson and Shakespeare. Besides our annual meeting, we have plans for an exciting 2022 EDIS International Conference in Seville on the topic of Dickinson and foreignhood. We now also have a YouTube channel where we have recordings of a new virtual series of talks we began this spring, #Dickinson Live. For more information, or if you wish to share and present your research, feel free to consult our website or send an email to me. Please don't hesitate to contact us if you have questions, comments, or suggestions. And with that, enjoy.
Hi, I'm Li-hsin, organizer of the Emily Dickinson International Society panel at ALA, along with Elizabeth Petrino and Renée Bergland. I'm from National Chengchi University, Taiwan. It is with great delight for me to introduce you to our 2021 panel on Emily Dickinson in Her and Our Time. This year, we have a very diverse group of presenters from 3 different continents. The topics range from romantic music and social media to religion, philosophy, and transnationalism. Although we decided not to include a Q&A component in our pre-recorded session this time due to our conflicting schedules, during the course of preparing for this recording, we formed an email group and workshop, exchanging our drafts and feedbacks with each other. The presentations proved to be surprisingly thought-provoking and interrelated on many levels, shedding new lights on Dickinson scholarship in many exciting directions. I hope you will enjoy the recordings as much as I did. All the contact information of our scholars should be available online, so please don't feel hesitant to contact us if you have any questions, comments, or suggestions. Enjoy!
Hello, everyone. My name is Mousumi Banerjee. I'm speaking from the English and Foreign Languages University Regional Campus, Shillong, situated in the state of Meghalaya in India, where I have the position of Associate Professor and the head of the Department of English Literature. This study that I've entitled As Much Madness as Divinest Sense, Exploring Kantian Transcendentality through the Dickinsonian Mind, is a part of my Fulbright postdoctoral research project, for which I worked as a visiting scholar at Amherst College at Amherst, Mass. during the academic session 2019-2020. With that, I would like to share my thoughts with you on some of the Kantian resonances that I find in Dickinson's poems, sometimes arbitrarily and at other times currently. To this, I would like to begin by saying that in the mire and confusion of everyday life, the only faculty that remains in the dark, or at least very often is dangerously threatened to, is that thinking. Act that is, in its intenser sense, can be considered phenomenal to the act of philosophizing. The reality of this fact is that human beings are potential thinkers, but not all are actually so. Hence, thinking is an action that is made possible by a deeper seeing into things, objects, and circumstances of the life that is lived every moment. This seeing into demands, in its turn, a deeper perspicacity that gives birth to resounding questions about the truth of existence, both of man and the world. This threefold pursuance of truth, that is thinking, seeing, questioning, is an endless process that sometimes baffles the engaged mind and causes it to rise above the considerations of the material world, which only emerges as a secondary form of truth to it. The insatiated mind then seeks more in the course of this endless phenomenon and tries to weave a mental narrative that is often complex, sometimes ingenious, and at other times personal. But the most elated form of such a mental activity would be transcendental. And the mind can be said to achieve this height of transcendentality when 'tis able to see things as pertaining to one whole that cannot be otherwise humanly envisaged in its totality. The mind becomes the site for perpetual construction and reconstruction of the world, a startling performative that ideates, struggles to express, undoes such expression, and creates again. In the process, what we get are flashes of truth, and through such flashes, an image of a constructed world, perhaps truer than the one felt to be true by virtue of it being lived. Emily Dickinson perhaps was one such mind that refused to accept the world as it is, and startlingly so at a time when women were forbidden to engage in writing or to receive higher education. Her times were conspicuously proscriptive, but she was herself seldom limited to the existing literary and intellectual injunctions. In this sense, she was not only an emancipated thinker, but also an intuitive creator. Thinking was her forte, and her supposedly self imposed renunciation was but to cerebrate deeply on her experience of the world and its nature. Her silence was rather deceptive, since the volume of her writing seldom demonstrates this feature. She valued silence only to enable herself to speak her mind. For this, she preferred the verse to be her manner of conversation with the world, a complex form of dialogue that was a part of her attempt, either consciously or unconsciously, to know the world. This conversation was an entirely inward experience that was intensely contemplative, renunciatory, and thus deeply philosophical. Suzanne Juhas remarks her move into the mind um, can best be understood as occasioned by her social and psychological situation as a woman who wanted to be a poet. But it is also important to note that the contradiction lay in the fact of her wish to be a poet and at the same time her unwillingness to publish her poetry, since she asserts publication is the auction of the mind of man. Poverty be justified for so foul a thing. Hence, mind is to her not only a space of its own, but the source of knowledge of her own existence. Interestingly, when she was a student at the Amherst Academy and later at the Mount Holyoke Female Seminary, she was intellectually exposed to academic philosophy that consisted of textbooks that dealt with mental philosophy, moral science, logic, rhetoric, classical literature, criticism, and the philosophy of the human mind. 'Tis perceivably from her school years in the 1840s that she had been growing up in the midst of a cultural ethos that was vibrantly philosophical and scientific at the same time. She herself delighted in the study of four subjects, as she jubilantly shares with A.B. Root in one of her letters. And she confesses, I have four studies. They are mental philosophy, geology, Latin, and botany. She continued to remain interested in philosophy. And noteworthy here is the fact that she was closely acquainted with Isaac Watts's Improvement of Mind, which was a requirement for academic curriculum at the Mount Holyoke Female Seminary. Even though she was reading the contemporary philosophers, she always had an inquisitive mind that sought to fearlessly question everything that she was taught to read and believe. Whether Dickinson can be envisaged as an organized and systematic philosopher may be debated in multiple ways, but that she had a palpable noumenal disposition in her thought can seldom be gainsaid. The unseen for her constituted best things, in a manner as unheard melodies were sweeter to John Keats in his Chrysanthemum Ode. And this negative capacity created the numerous possibilities that her verse resonated so overwhelmingly. The fact of this multiplicity of dimension that the non visual can have bears the urgency of being seen as realized and pronounced in terms of immediately felt and experienced associations and finer act of poetic utterance. Dickinson says, I felt cleaving in my mind, as if my brain had split. I tried to match it sin by sin, but could not make them fit. The thought behind I strove to join unto the thought before, but sequence ravelled out of sound, like bars upon a floor. The theme of disorganization and doubt is not merely a poetic misgiving here, but a reality that the speaker lives through and remains experientially unable to weave together into a seamless sequentiality. She addresses a psychosomatic convulsion that she senses within and perhaps helplessly attempts to give expression to. The lack emerging from the fact that 19th century physiologists and phrenologists uh, did not really speak to the philosophical questions and the patterns in imaginative or reasoned thought. The mental landscape was still intractable and needed a commensurate vocabulary, a fact that constituted a major challenge for the poet to conceptually meet. The irreconcilability between the medico-physiological phrenological idiom and a poetic associationist expression is revealed through the poet's tripological redescription of two practically dissonant, though theoretically complicit ideas. Sequence seems to ravel out of sound like bells upon a floor, or rather like bars upon a floor. The poet here perhaps makes an attempt to draw a reader's attention to the impossibility of conjoining thought a priori and thought a posteriori, a feature that poetry also has to demonstrate in order to bear the truth about the failure of any human attempt to be able to conceive of the mind's myriad intricacies and the way in which it functions. Sharon Cameron observes in Dickinson's poetry the apparent paradoxical quality of creation, of the fiction of disorientation, while rescuing the reader from the fact of it. For Dickinson, this peril of uncertainty and skepticism is concerned with the unknowability of the convolutions of the mind and its mystifying inconsistencies and disjunctions. Jed Depman aligns this poem with the neo-Kantian group emphasizing repeated attempt and failure. I tried to match but could not. I strove to join, but Dickinson was in this manner gradually slipping into the Kantian romantic vocabulary of beauty and the sublime in ways that were not merely experimental, but were shockingly new and inimitably revolutionary. Dickinson had already begun to be exposed to German philosophy in general, and to the Kantian system of idealism in particular, through the eminent New England thinkers like Emerson, as her commitment to a new poetics, her various emphases on mind as an active, dangerous, and powerful experimental agent, and her idiosyncratic departure from religious orthodoxy, resiliently demonstrated her artistic affiliation to the evolving ethos of the discourse of the mind. The extent of the mind is boundless, and hence Dickinson would seldom fall prey to the allurement of potentially attempting to define every object in nature. Her art entailed a delving deep into the realm of possibility, not certainty. She shares Kant's consternation that the mind, more often than not, is inescapably driven to knowing that which cannot be known, or in other words, transcends all knowing. For her, the posture of our immortal mind was significantly different from an imperceptive material conception that does not necessarily impress upon human thought, in that it is the modes of thinking that conform to the objects presented in nature, thereby leading the way to the formation of knowledge. Dickinson has this clear vision of the metaphysical function of mind and expresses her consciousness of the sly presumption that tis often tendentially driven towards. As Ben Kimball suggests on the essential point of an ideological convergence between Kant and Dickinson, the former made his moral philosophy breathe through the acts of his life, thereby enacting the character inherent in the idea of person he strove to conceptualize. And the latter made her entire life a stark emblem of the poetry she created in a way as to almost live her poetry herself. A conscious nurturance of this character has always been fundamental to Kant's philosophical system, in which a person needs to cultivate certain capacities to gain experiences that he otherwise would not have had had he not conditioned himself thus. This faculty of the human mind is not given a priori, but is rather developed as a person comes to have certain enriched experiences beyond the material and the sensuous. This form of sensitivity discloses to the person such properties of objects that is within his nurtured capacities to be able to see and experience. In other words, in order to have a sense of the transcendental, one needs to possess the self-perception, which not only enables him to weigh and judge the essential value of an object, but also realize the inherent unity that it shares with other objects within the intuitive domains of space and time, a fundamental quality that validates its existence in a world of relativity and relationality. In the poem, much madness has divinest sense to a discerning eye, much sense the starkest madness. The speaker nurtures a discernment or perceptivity that could envisage the transcendental through the starkest form of madness. The verse throbs with an miraculous strain of a possible triumph of realization of the divine, a sense only the sane is endowed to possess, as opposed to the demurrer, who in his denial of this truth is straightway dangerous and handled with a chain. But what is interestingly undenying here is the Kantian tenor of sensing, thinking, conceiving, perceiving, seeing, and realizing the source of all knowledge. In brief, a process that is achievable only by a poetic employment of much madness. The autonomy of Dickinson's poetic self leads her to exercise her free will that helps her transcend the boundaries of empirical evidence. Epistemologically, Dickinson revelled in transcendental idealism envisaged by Kant, whereby the transcendental self emerges when the external environment is variedly perceived through the passage of time, as a result of which emerge manifold perceptions or representations that together constitute a product of intuition. The poetic anxiety lies here in that flicker of wisdom whizzing past the poet's mind and never coming back to her again. The verse poses faith in the mind's capacity to achieve the subliminal depths of the innate laws of thought, but at the same time, in a perspicaciously Kantian manner, realizes the limit or inadequacy of the imagination to completely visualize the noumenon. Her keen insight into the mental phenomenon, nevertheless, helps her perceive the irreducible presence of the thing she met before. But imagination apart, she is also aware of the obvious insufficiency of human language that can befittingly reify such an ethereal confrontation between the poet and the thought. She remains in quest of an appropriate philology by delving deep into her imagination to express the hitherto elusive transcendental vision. Despite the limitation of the finiteness of language in grasping the ungraspable, she does repose faith in imagination's power that can lead her to the apotheotic destination she is endeavoring to achieve, since she reminisces, somewhere in my soul, I know, I've met the thing before. Here one cannot but allude to Dickinson's inclination towards German affected metaphysics and the way in which she was touched by the resulting emergence of transcendentalism, much in the manner of Emerson, Parker, and others. The verse is a felicitous expression of Dickinson's engagement with the neo-Kantian slant, with a solitary, self-reliant, and thoughtful poetic practice, a new poetics, one might say, that would emerge from a rigorous, dauntless, robust, and an avant-garde mind. Thank you all so very much. I would like to have your opinions on this study of mine. Please feel free to communicate with me on mousumi.guha@fulbrightmail.org. Thanks again all so very much.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Amy Crawford, and today I will be presenting my paper titled The Smart Misery, Emily Dickinson and Spiritual Intellectualism. I want to go ahead and start off the presentation with a small piece of a letter that Dickinson wrote to her dear friend Abby Root in 1846. In this letter, Dickinson is describing the different revivals that came through Amherst a few months prior, and it's discussing her refusal to make a profession of faith. And the section that I want to emphasize says, "I am continually putting off becoming a Christian. Evil voices lisp in my ear. There is time yet enough. I feel that every day I live, I sin more and more, in the closing of my heart to the offers of mercy which are presented to me freely." Growing up as a member of a socially prominent and devout household, Dickinson struggled to reconcile the image of God presented to her with her own opinions of spirituality. Concepts such as faith, spirituality, salvation, and tradition weighed heavy on the poet's mind, and her diverging opinions on the topics contradicted with the expectations of her society. Dickinson's formative years occurred during two of the most influential intellectual movements, Transcendentalism and the Great Awakenings. These movements aroused out of rapid intellectual evolution and led to the industrial expansion and religious questioning. Dickinson's response to these movements can be understood in the religious poems she composed during her lifetime, specifically her inclination towards quantifiable religious beliefs over blind faith. In the context of this discussion, faith will be referred to as the conventional practice of Calvinist Christianity throughout Dickinson's lifetime, and spirituality is the synthesis of faith and secular ideas. By outwardly expressing her religious doubts because of her tendency towards secular and revolutionary teachings, she is exercising her intellectual autonomy or an independence of thought. Some of Dickinson's most anthologized poems reveal her rejection of organized religion in favor of a secular form of piety that is rooted in humanist and intellectual leanings. Although she challenges propriety, Dickinson's critique of Christianity is not an affirmation of atheism, but this is evidence of her comprehensive religious understanding and her dedication to intellectualism. By analyzing a concise collection of Dickinson's religious poems such as "The Bible is an Antique Volume," "Of Course I Prayed," and "Some Keep the Sabbath Going to Church," readers will recognize that the transcendental influences and its emphasis on intellectual autonomy. Dickinson's unique consciousness was a result of her tumultuous adolescence at Mount Holyoke Female Seminary, where students were expected to make public professions of salvation in order to be considered established members of their community. According to Dickinson, religion is something that could be customized to each believer, and the poet's own religion was one based off of intellectual concepts. These ideas being dispersed conflicted with the decorum of the Victorian period, but it is worth noting that the religious austerity that is assumed of the 19th century is not entirely correct. By the time Dickinson began composing poems that critiqued Christianity, the religious landscape of New England was already transforming into one that would have been unrecognizable to the poet's ancestors. Dickinson's poetics are therefore a reaction to these changes, and her criticism of Christianity reflects wavering uncertainty rather than outright unbelief. And that is a quote from London. Once Dickinson accepted that no form of institutionalized religion could satisfy her unique requirements, she became more and more comfortable challenging the status quo and crafting poems that reflected her spiritual needs. Accordingly, the criteria for Dickinson's religion included intellectual, individualistic, and unconventional associations. Dickinson's intentions were never to disregard organized religion altogether, only to reimagine it in a way that transcended customary practices. The Transcendental movement sought to, quote, restore the vital connection between nature, people, and God. This is from Martin. And to, quote, attain sublime moments of grace by studying nature and becoming a mortal embodiment of God. By equating themselves with God, the Transcendentalists were able to achieve an emotional freedom that was discouraged by conventional Christianity. Dickinson's Calvinist upbringing would have contradicted the Transcendental school of thought, and her ability to explore creeds outside of her cultural community is proof of her intellectual aptitude. Above all, Dickinson valued intellectual autonomy. She desired the freedom to explore her own methods of spirituality, to connect to a God that adhered to her worldly desires and did not condemn her doubts, and poetry gave her this freedom. Dickinson's poetic style can be characterized as a conglomeration of opposing ideas, both secular and pious, forward-thinking and nostalgic, modern and traditional. Her frequent use of biblical imagery and language allowed her to be anthologized as a religious poet. However, the poet's linguistic associations can be perceived as blasphemous due to her secular tendencies. One example of Dickinson's indirect blasphemy is seen in her poem "The Bible is an Antique Volume," which presents the poet's contradictory relationship with Calvinist beliefs through linguistic dichotomy. Dickinson characterizes the Bible as antique because it was written by fated men at the suggestion of holy specters. The use of the word antique, fated, and suggestion diminish the influence of the sacred text and present it as stale and uninteresting. Dickinson reimagines the Old Testament as an exciting tale performed by a warbling teller in the subsequent lines that present Eden as the ancient homestead and Satan as the brigadier. The subsequent lines use identical syntax to reimagine a religious caste as characters rather than biblical figures. By associating these figures with fantastical character descriptions, Dickinson is crafting a story that captivates and does not condemn. This piece in turn becomes an example of Dickinson's use of poetry as a cathartic outlet and her attempt at crafting a parable in her own image. Dickinson's use of other in this piece can be interpreted as the poet's own feelings of disassociation and isolation. Sin is described as a distinguished precipice others must resist, suggesting that those who are saved do not face the same temptations as those who are not. This is perhaps a testament to Dickinson's religious frustration and her assumption that those who are saved do not experience temptation of secular experiences. The following lines read, "Boys that believe are very lonesome, other boys are lost," which can be interpreted as a reference to the poet's own experience with organized religion. Dickinson would have seen Christian acceptance as something that would make her feel isolated or lonesome, because it would have meant sacrificing her principles to conform to an expectation. Her refusal of any public profession caused her to be othered by her community, to which they considered her a lost soul or a lost cause. The use of irreverent diction and pagan references suggests that she possesses an iconoclastic view of religion, but the poem's lighthearted tone can also reflect a childlike desire to present Christianity in a more captivating way. The allusion to the pagan figure Orpheus would have been considered a blasphemous connection because Dickinson presents his sermon as superior to conventional Christian sermons. Quote, "Orpheus's sermon captivated, it did not condemn." This distinction suggests that Dickinson's longing for captivation over condemnation places pagan teachings above Christian ones, and this is proof of Dickinson's ability to separate herself from fundamental traditions and create connections between the past and the present. The Bible is an Antique Volume presents the reader with the poet's desire for creative expression and tolerance within the religion that she forges for herself. In addition to blasphemous associations, Dickinson also explored spiritual doubts that can be considered detrimental to the Christian soul. The most explicit example of Dickinson's religious doubt is explored in the poem titled "Of Course I Prayed." In this poem, Dickinson produces a critical tone to analyze the relationship between God and his followers. The speaker initiates the conversation between herself and an unnamed recipient by answering the unspoken question, "Of course I prayed, and did God care?" This poem is more abstract than the others by Dickinson, and interpretations of the identities of the speakers or recipient are ultimately futile. Opposing interpretations of these figures do not contradict the poem's primary purpose, which is Dickinson's own anguish over unanswered prayers. This iteration of God is disconnected and indifferent toward his creations. The speaker is frustrated by the negligence and compares God's inattention to the air in which a bird has stamped her foot. This image suggests that any efforts toward a closer relationship with God are empty and will ultimately result in nothing. The following lines discuss the speaker's perception of prayer as a selfish act in which believers make appeals of God. They stamp their foot and make demands of God because that is how they regard prayer. This depiction of Christians as selfish and greedy can be interpreted as the poet's own feelings toward typical Christians. The following lines read, "My reason, life, I had not had," which suggests that the speaker places themselves above conventional Christian followers. The speaker is praying for life and for answers. In this instance, life could be referring to spiritual existence and not merely existence. They want to know what they are experiencing. They want to know why they are experiencing this doubt and how they can live in accordance with it. Existential questions also emerge in the lines that read, "'Twere better charity to leave me in the Adam's tomb, merry and not and gay and numb, than this smart misery." In these lines, the speaker insinuates that living in ignorance of the internal struggle between themselves and God would be preferable to the smart misery that commands their thoughts. This poem is an example of Dickinson's spiritual frustration and her characterization of God as an impartial observer to human suffering. It's one reference to her break with Calvinist teachings that emphasize holy certainty. This certainty comes from the form of an unwavering belief in God, his plan, and dictates that followers should not seek to understand the infinite definition of God, because as finite creatures, they are incapable of comprehending his true nature. Dickinson's use of transcendental ideals and secular imagery are also present in the poem titled "Some Keep the Sabbath Going to Church," in which the poet presents her home as a cathedral and her Sunday worship as an introspective meditation on spiritual acceptance. In this poem, Dickinson defines her Sabbath with contradictory yet humble comparisons and a conclusion that challenges Calvinist teachings of salvation, which state that salvation can only be achieved through the performance of good deeds on earth. Dickinson immediately associates herself as the speaker by declaring, "Some keep the Sabbath going to church. I keep it staying at home." The poet's use of I isolates the speaker from most churchgoers and suggests that the speaker refuses to adhere to religious conventions. The following lines describe Dickinson's church as an organic environment that has a bobolink for a cloister and an orchard for a dome, which is a reference to the Transcendentalist belief that the true religious awakenings are experienced in nature because that is where God is in his most pure form. Dickinson returns to humble imagery with the lines that read, and instead of tolling the bell for church, our little sexton sings." Here Dickinson is expressing satisfaction in a small community that she has created and believes that it is superior to any grand cathedral. Dickinson's internal struggle with organized religion is finally presented in an accepting and hopeful tone in the final stanza that read, "God preaches, a noted clergyman, and the sermon is never long. So instead of getting to heaven at last, I'm going all along." This quatrain contains ideas of individualized worship, humble yet blasphemous imagery, and secular presentations of heaven and eternity. Dickinson claims that God preaches to her directly, not through an elevated member of the church. This suggests that feelings of intimacy and comfort between Dickinson and her God, and the fact that the sermon is never long, also demonstrates that her Sabbath day includes more than just indoctrination. One of her most explicit challenges of Calvinist teachings, Dickinson declares that she is experiencing heaven here on earth and not participating in a life of repression and restraint. This contradicts the essential belief that for a soul to reach heaven, they must participate in a life free of secular desires and suppressed feelings of unnecessary pleasure. Dickinson then establishes the central tenet of her religion, acceptance. Dickinson desires acceptance from her community and God, and by redefining Christianity in terms that she aligns with what she can feel some satisfaction in religion. The poet concludes that a life well lived can also be a life lived well, and that her heaven is not a goal to be achieved, but a feeling that is experienced when finding God in the small pleasures of the world. To Emily Dickinson, worldly pleasures should not be rejected as a form of penance, but enjoyed every day. Portrayed as a reclusive and sentimental poet, Emily Dickinson has been mythologized as a writer whose verse are regularly misinterpreted to conform to her persona. Her inability to abstain from the secular pleasures of the physical world compelled her to forge her own form of religion that adhered to a specific subset of intellectual and blasphemous characteristics such as transcendental thought and unconventional comparisons. The grief felt by Dickinson regarding her religious nonconformity is reflected within the lines of her poems, and she hoped, quote, "at some time the heavenly gates would be opened and receive her, and the angels would consent to call her sister." This is from the same letter mentioned before. Dickinson desired an orthodox relationship with religion, but her inclination towards intellectual interpretations and quantifiable thought prevented her from achieving it. The most logical solution to this plight would then be to redefine religion in terms that Dickinson could accept and tenets that were logical. tenets that were rooted in intellectual, individualistic, and secular beliefs. Dickinson's spiritual consciousness resided in the liminal space between the smart misery and the confidence of spiritual confirmation. Thank you so much.
I want to start by thanking the organizers for including me in this panel, and thank you all for listening in. Rhythm is foundational to both poetry and music. In music, rhythm is measured as tempo, in poems as meter. But music has a more robust system for notating rhythm than poetry, and therefore of quantifying and discussing rhythm. Musical composers can specify the number of pulses in a given period using time signatures, speed using terms such as lento for slow or allegro for quick, and pauses using written rests. They can divide the pulse into eighths, sixteenths, and so on, and notate emphasis with directions such as staccato and legato, which emphasize or smooth pulses, ties and slurs, which connect phrases across beats, and syncopation, or accents between beats. Music also has performance conventions, often unscripted. Among these is rubato, a word meaning robbed or stolen time, and signifying the expressive alteration of rhythm or tempo. William Rothstein writes that rubato is widely regarded as a purely intuitive act, making it a difficult subject to theorize. Techniques to achieve rubato include ritardando, a slowing down, and ritenuto, a holding back. Rothstein uses the phrases thickening and temporal viscosity to describe their effect. A corresponding term for speeding up rhythm is accelerando. Early writings on the subject suggested that any time stolen from the expected rhythm had to be paid back, so to speak. A delay in one place was thought to require a speeding up nearby. According to Rothstein, this is seldom the case in practice. In any case, David Epstein writes that the gratification of good rubato playing lies in the eventual reconciliation of the modified tempo with the expected one. Epstein writes that a sense of freedom is associated with this kind of movement in and out of the prevalent rhythm. Rubato was particularly important during the Romantic era, which overlaps with Dickinson's life. Franz Liszt described the practice with an evocative metaphor, writing, "Look at those trees. The wind plays in the leaves, develops life in them, but the tree remains the same." That is Chopin's rubato. Much as Frédéric Chopin composed in familiar, flexible forms such as mazurkas, nocturnes, and waltzes, Dickinson's poems rely on sturdy, pliable, formal structures, such as the alternating 4-beat and 3-beat lines of common meter. What makes Dickinson's prosody distinctive is her creative divergences from these familiar meters and her satisfying returns from those divergences. Rubato offers a useful way to think about these qualities, the striking rhythmic variations within and across manuscripts. Dickinson's dashes tend to slow down the anticipated rhythmic flow and lend the poems an analogous sense of freedom as they diverge from and reconcile with the anticipated familiar pulse. Variation in the use of dashes from manuscript to manuscript accords with musical practice, in which scores are customized with performance markings that are variable, and performances differ depending on their time, conditions, and audience. In the next few minutes, I will briefly discuss Dickinson's musical knowledge, especially related to tempo variation. Then I will read a few instances of her expressive alterations of rhythm in poems, her use of robbed or stolen time. We'll probably never know the full extent of Dickinson's musical experience, but we do know that she both listened to and played music. She heard music in a variety of settings, such as Amherst College events, at Amherst Academy and Mount Holyoke, in churches, home parlors, town events, and circuses, as well as in more formal concert settings. She sang and played music with friends and family from a young age and owned a piano by age 14. The standard instruction textbook she used does not mention rubato, but it does teach terms related to specific tempo modifications, such as accelerando, rallentando, and ritardando. Dickinson collected dozens of pieces of sheet music, many of which show her penciled markings. Like her instruction book, Dickinson's sheet music collection includes terms associated with rubato, but not the word itself. But rubato is a performance technique, often employed independent of printed markings at the discretion of the performer. Dickinson's sheet music offers clues about her performance style, but the recollections of friends and family may be a better guide to how she sounded. These describe a playing style that was unbound by formal convention, with phrases such as pure mischief, weird and beautiful, and frolics. Dickinson also likely encountered rubato in performances by others or written descriptions of music. Among the performers she heard was Jenny Lind, who is now best remembered for the spectacle of her US tour, which was initially sponsored by P.T. Barnum. But Lind was a serious singer, a favorite of composers. In Paris, she had been a student of the singing teacher Manuel Garcia, whose specialty was rubato. She later met and befriended the famously flinty Chopin. In short, Lind was respected by those who specialized in rubato and almost certainly employed it in the performance Dickinson heard in Northampton in 1851. Anton Rubinstein, whom Dickinson may have heard perform during his 1873 tour, was another acknowledged master of the technique. So what does rubato look like in the setting of a poetry manuscript? I will suggest that it looks a lot like this brief poem in iambic trimeter. The dashes might be read as doing something like caesuras, pausing the forward motion to allow the reader to draw breath. But these are short lines, and unlike classical caesuras, which usually appear halfway through a line or midway roughly, Dickinson's move around, and sometimes two or more cluster together. On the left side, I've removed the dashes to show how the poem might look and sound if presented in its underlying meter. I've replaced the dashes with pauses on the right side. The effect is subjective, but then rubato is explicitly about the subjective choices of the performer in interpreting the text and those of the audience to those choices. Dickinson seems to use the dashes here not to achieve one effect, but to serve a variety of expressive purposes. Sometimes they seem to emphasize individual words, to make a dramatic pause as before a plot twist, to create a contrast, or even maybe to signal a rethinking or a kind of meta commentary on what has just been said. In terms of emphasis, notice the strangeness of the list that closes out the first stanza. A list of things that the sunset confers ignorance of. First, territory, which is to say the landscape, then color, then circumference or the perceivable range of earth and sky, and finally, decay. The sunset distracts us for one glorious moment from our own destruction. This turn from the visual to the abstract, progressing from vastness and beauty to dissipation, relies on the separations the dashes provide, the interruption of the sing-songy meter. There's a similar moment in the second stanza. With its amber revelation, we seem to be back on track. The sunset is described as a colorful message from God. The next line describes its effect, but the verbs exhilarate and debase have such profoundly divergent significations that in sequence, in a more conventional prosody, they would be virtually meaningless. The dash creates a wait a minute pause, like the letdown as the colors of the sunset fade and you're left in darkness. We found ourselves partaking in a glory larger than ourselves, only to find at the end our own smallness, as though God were suddenly looking through the other end of the telescope at us. We might even find, as in the third stanza, that the power of God's sunset victory, with the dashes here like trumpet blasts, depends on this contrast, the celestial looking down, startling us into the recognition that, unlike our immortal observer, we are here only temporarily. One of the best examples in Dickinson's work of this kind of pause as rethinking comes halfway through Because I Could Not Stop for Death. There is a kind of internal logic to the poem's first half, which is like the romancing of the innocent in a sentimental seduction novel. Then at the poem's midpoint, the carriage passes the setting sun, signaling nightfall. The pauses in the next line function just as rubato is supposed to, intentionally slowing down or holding back the rhythm for expressive purposes. The delays and the line break after he passed us have the further effect of reversing common meter. First 3 beats in a line, then 4. They reinforce the sense of reversion, prompting a turn to first reconsidering what has gone before, then realizing what is different. The return to the familiar meter makes the progression toward the graveyard feel eerily inevitable, normal. In the next stanza, the carriage's pause ironically sets off an uninterrupted 3-line phrase. The remaining dashes all follow difficult to accept ideas. The house in the ground, the roof scarcely visible, and the final unimaginable realization that 'tis centuries since the poem's action took place. This seems like a good moment to return to the idea that the robbed time of Rubato must in some sense be paid back. While musicologists consider this idea archaic, it seems reasonable that a slowing down in one place makes the return to the standard tempo feel like a speeding up. Here, the return to the unimpeded flow of common meter after the delay of a dash or a series of dashes can lend subsequent phrases a feeling of hurry. The closing phrase, in which the elapsed centuries feel shorter than the moment of realization, is the second longest in the poem, with no dashes. This poem, Dust is the Only Secret, exists in 2 manuscript copies, both from 1860. Pages on the right are from fascicle 8. The highlighted phrases emphasize the seemingly contradictory, or maybe all-encompassing, qualities of death. Industrious, laconic, punctual, sedate. The exclamation marks sharply stop the rhythm's progression and signal a kind of forte vocal expression, emphasizing the power and inevitability of death. The page on the left was sent to Susan Dickinson, whose critical eye and ear the poet Emily Dickinson valued. Here, the exclamation marks become dashes, lowering the temperature a little. Rhythmic variation is still indicated, but in a more subdued mezzo forte tone, resulting in a rhythmic viscosity, to use William Rothstein's term. As in An Ignorance of Sunset, the dashes emphasize the incongruity of these 4 adjectives in sequence. Perhaps a kind of playfulness is implied. Death, the orphan without playmates, forgotten in his hometown, seems too certain of himself, a reading supported by the final stanza in which Christ arrives to save the souls from the nest death has built. Numerous critics have written about Dickinson's use of dashes. Most would agree with Alexandra Socarides that the dashes constitute a tool to interrupt the linear progression of time. The question is whether there is something distinctive about how she took up and used this tool. Edith Wilder thought Dickinson borrowed methods from 19th century rhetorical notation, and this idea of borrowing across disciplines has remained current. As far back as 1960, Dickinson's punctuation seemed to Charles Anderson like an attempt to create a new system of musical notation for reading her verse. But what does this mean in practice? If the intention is to guide the reading of the poems, it might not be necessary to invent a whole new system of notation. Dashes were fairly common in 19th century writing, both literary and popular. Many writers Dickinson admired used them, from Lord Byron to Lydia Sigourney to Elizabeth Barrett Browning to Ike Marvell. Perhaps it is more useful to say that Dickinson adapted existing systems of literary notation to control the progression of time in ways typical of the music of her era, which is to say not only expressively, but extemporaneously and variably. While we don't have time for questions, I welcome your thoughts by email. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Micah Bateman. I'm going to be presenting a paper called Dickinson's Misery 2.0, Hope is the Thing with Feathers as Twitter Ritual. The thing with feathers we all know is hope, not because we're trained scholars or voracious readers of 19th century verse, but because the phrase has approached the status of idiom through its many remediations. When something bad happens, we can be sure that this creaturely abstraction will spread its wings within the view afforded by our vast mediascape. Our feathered friend has taken flight following terrorist attacks, mass shootings, celebrity deaths, and election results. In the image that's currently pulled up, you can see a major spike in tweets from Twitter that contain the exact string "thing with feathers" following the presidential election of Donald Trump. The secondary spike you see there is from Emily Dickinson's birthday in 2016. The following slide shows a spike in "thing with feathers" tweets on Twitter in 2017 following the Las Vegas shootings. In all, at least 198,616 posts on Twitter have contained the exact string "thing with feathers" since Twitter's beginning in 2006. Sharing the poem has, in effect, become a rite of the mediatized rituals of social tragedy described by Stephanie Alice Baker, in which, quote, shared experiences of social suffering become collectively meaningful. How strange that such a strange poem by a not typically altogether optimistic Emily Dickinson should provide such public comfort. For along with Whitman, Dickinson was a poet who engaged the US Civil War, but unlike Whitman's wound dresser who would mend the broken body politic, Dickinson's poetics inclined toward opening the wound, seeming at times to delight in the spectacle of war's vermilion wheels and capitalizing on it to produce her most fantastical and gruesome images, quoting a poem: "An artery upon the hill, a vein along the road, great globules in the alleys, and oh, the shower of stain when winds upset the basin and spill the scarlet rain." While Whitman addressed the wound culture of the Civil War to position himself as one to remedy the wound, Dickinson splashed in the puddles of blood afforded by the wound culture of the war's pathological print public sphere. Given Dickinson's corpus, hope likelier evokes an albatross than a dove. But this opinion is in the popular minority. To others, hope, even Dickinson's, is necessarily hopeful. To relatively few social media users, Trump was the thing with feathers bringing hope to a dark nation. I'm cutting here to a tweet from a Trump supporter that quotes from "Hope is the thing with feathers" and mentions real Donald Trump's now, defunct account on Twitter, and hashtags it with "MAGA, Make America Great Again," which was the motto of Donald Trump's campaign. To others, Trump's election was the darkness that publics should keep hope within. One such user was Dan Rather, who has made a career of hope in times of political turmoil. Leading up to his release of the optimistically reconciliatory "What Unites Us? Reflections on Patriotism," he upped his social media game, amply borrowing from American poets such as Whitman and Dickinson along the way. A centrist against Trump, Rather has posted Dickinson's a poem about hope in full twice since the 2016 presidential election darkened his blue sky. First on New Year's Day 2017, and then again on August 4th, 2017. Rather introduced the first of these posts saying of Dickinson, quote, "Her words are a reminder that across the centuries, there are certain human truths that remain inviolable. And one of the most important of these is hope." He reintroduced the poem in the second instance with a note that, quote, "I hope you find the poem as hopeful as I do." Like most, Rather finds Dickinson's hope hopeful. Most of his commenters agreed. The two posts together garnered more than 12,000 shares and 68,000 reactions, including 52,000 likes and 14.8 thousand love reactions. Many of the 2.3 thousand comments were affective and affirmative, thanking Rather for giving users hope amid a despondent or hopeless time. Many comments as well, unlike with replies to many comments as well, engaged the poem. Users responded to Rather's post with memories of encountering the poem in school or elsewhere, that it could be sung to popular tunes, and with other poems by Dickinson as well as other poets, including themselves. One contrarian user wrote that, quote, "Hope is as useless as fear. Both of these emotions replace the cognizance to best address the situation. Do what is right. We are Charlie Brown with Lucy holding the football. Over and over and over again, it is time to change the game entirely, end quote. To my mind, this user more broadly laments Facebook's and even more broadly the public sphere's affective rather than rational discursive flows. And the user's wish for rational strategy is also brought out in his dismissal of hope, which he reads in the illustration of Lucy with the football, as what Lauren Berlant calls cruel optimism, the hope that actually keeps one entrenched in suffering. The user's objection highlights how Rather's post functions within the online public sphere of social media through affective public formations that may or may not be partisanly strategic. Most of the engagements with Rather's posts, even in the comments, were nonpartisan, even as the post was occasioned and inflected by present political turmoil. But regardless of the political efficacy of calling together a hopeful public, is Dickinson's hope even hopeful? Here I read the poem in full. Hope is the thing with feathers that perches in the soul and sings the tune without the words and never stops at all. And sweetest in the gale is heard, and sore must be the storm that could abash the little bird that kept so many warm. I've heard it in the chillest land and on the strangest sea, yet never in extremity it asked a crumb of me. Dickinson imagines hope as a medial gesture with a functional value superseding a symbolic one. Hope sings the tune without the words because the medium, song, traditionally associated with lyric poetry, is more important than its content, words. The medium is the only message. Hope is hopeful regardless of its context in the gale or the chillest land or on the strangest sea. The sealed off thing, even in extremity, asks nothing of its subjective interlocutor, the speaker of the poem, precisely because its dreadful power lies in its inscrutability, as like Philomela the nightingale testifying non-verbally to her rape, it sings a song without words that can therefore not authentically be interpreted using verbal faculties. To Dickinson, hope is scary because it can't actually mean anything at all. As an empty signifier, it's portable in that it means whatever we need it to mean by not meaning but being. The poem even opens with hope in quotation marks, as if Dickinson has lifted the word with white gloves from another's dusty text. Hope is not only portable, it's already ported. Moreover, hope is abstracted from the vacated totemicity of the thing with feathers, which, depending on the public context in which hope is bidden, could be a bird popularly signifying the poet, nightingale, Christian promise, the dove, or military might, the eagle. I should note here that Rather took his vacated totemicity not as a rhetorical exercise, but as an invitation to fill in the blank, and included with his post an image of the state bird of New York to regionalize his call to hope figured as birdsong. But Dickinson is probing the structures of media or symbol making that ritually give hope to audiences who have predetermined the symbolic meaning of the gesture as hopeful. Namely, as others have pointed out, this means Christian audiences. Dickinson's poetry departs from hymn because Dickinson is interested in secular and verbal meaning making. Hymns, of course, rely on verbality for symbological purposes, but hymns' symbols, like their tunes, have a ritual function that invites feeling and Christian solidarity rather than interpretation. Hymns are used ritually for affective attunement. The quote, heavenly hurt, brought on by the quote, imperial and oppressive heft of cathedral tunes, to turn to another highly circulated poem by Dickinson, unites and humbles a congregation under a unifying emotional regime that is predetermined by religious ritual. Likewise, aviary symbols and birdsong unite imperiled publics under a sustaining regime of hopefulness that is predetermined by the context of peril and premediated by Christian practice, at least to imperiled Christians for whom, according to Holmes and Barber's 1846 religious emblems, quote, the proper use of hope is to keep the soul calm and secure in the day of adversity. Hopeful messaging in the Christian sense adheres in this case to James Carey's ritual view of communication, which holds that a primary aim of communication is to maintain a society in time rather than to transmit information. Following Carey, ritual theorists have posited that ritual is a mostly conservative force that often manufactures consent. I read Dickinson's scare-quoted hope within such cautionary frameworks. Dickinson's certain slant of light, which codes cathedral tunes as oppressive, points to a reckoning with communitarian ritual practice as conservative and imperial. To Dickinson, the affective attunement of ritual, which Durkheim described as collective effervescence that makes people feel like part of a community, is a pre-mediating force that limits the power to make meaning. Dickinson was imagining the fearful situation of the poem itself as medium beyond its medium, birdsong regardless of context, one that shapes and transduces meaning without precisely making it, one that, like the inscrutable singing thing with feathers that never stops, marks duration without making history. Dickinson's poem, like the hope within it, is only a function that mediates the feelings of its perceivers. The thing with feathers that has kept so many warm is like the poem itself that functions as solace without necessarily singing solace. Like the laugh track or the hired mourner, both Dickinson's poem and its thing with feathers emote for you, despite Dickinson's objections to the imperial nature of affective ritual media. What can a bird's tune without words transmit, if not hope and the affective attunement of hopefulness, even if that bird is the raped Philomela singing defiantly with her tongue cut out? This poem, as much as any other, proves Virginia Jackson right. Lyricization was Dickinson's misery, but it keeps so many warm. Another respondent to Rather indicates my point in reproducing another of Dickinson's poems about hope. Here I'm turning to the comment itself, and I'll read the poem. Hope is a subtle glutton. He feeds upon the fair, and yet inspected closely, what abstinence is there? His is the halcyon table that never seats but one, and whatsoever is consumed, the same amount remain. In this poem, posted as a response to Rather's hopefully situated other poem by Dickinson, hope gluts upon the fair without materially acting upon them at all. What abstinence? In a zero-sum game of consumption, whatsoever is consumed, the same amount remain, amid a halcyon table conferring contextual feelings of happiness. Hope is the host of a feast, but only hope feasts on the preordained fair who are drawn to its halcyon promise. The fair, it might be said, are Dickinson's naively Christian performative readers, drawn to invocations of hope like moths to a flame. As the Dickinsonian soul selects her own society, Dickinson distrusts the performative virtuosity of Calvinist readings aimed to confer the pre-selection of Christian readers. A Calvinist hermeneutic then reduces verbal meaning making to a pre-meaning function that still medially makes internal difference, but not in the way Dickinson as a poet would like. Several respondents to Rather's posts thank him for providing or being a beacon, quote, beacon of hope, a word typically figured in its first two definitions as a light. In this, Dickinson's hope resembles McLuhan's pure information, figured as the electric light. Here I'm quoting a block quote from McLuhan about pure information. Whether the light is being used for brain surgery or night baseball is a matter of indifference. It could be argued that these activities are in some way the content of the electric light, since they could not exist without the electric light. This fact merely underlines the point that the medium is the message, because it is the medium that shapes and controls the scale and form of human association and action. The content or uses of such media are as diverse as they are ineffectual in shaping the form of human association. Indeed, it is only too typical that the content of any medium blinds us to the character of the medium. McLuhan goes on to illustrate his famous dictum that the medium is the message with lines from Shakespeare. But soft, what light through yonder window breaks? It speaks and yet says nothing. Dickinson's hope is the medium that is the message. She figures her fear of verbally vacated birdsong, predetermined to mean and to keep so many warm, regardless of context, as a gluttonous and feathered hope. It speaks and yet says nothing. Like bird or beacon, it acts beyond verbal and thus authorial reckoning. If it sings a tune, who cares about the words? The tune itself inspires hopefulness. Thus, Dickinson foresaw the usage of her hope among a naive community of fair readers upon whom that hope, to return to Bergland's cruel optimism, would immaculately feast without consequence, accepting the warmth of pure information and its halcyon promise. Dickinson respected and feared the affective idealization of poetry stemming from Christian reading that would inevitably, to her misery, continue well past modernism. She warned us of poetry's lyricization most pointedly in the poem We Can't Stop Ritually Sharing.
Welcome to my talk, Dickinson's Transnational Landscapes. My name is Christa Vogelius, and I'm joining you from the University of Copenhagen. I want to frame this talk by saying that I'm working on a book project on 19th century American women writers and American literary nationalism, where I'm trying to think about creative practices of copying, like literary art description, commonplace bookkeeping, and drawing instruction in relation to mid-19th century ideas about literary originality and nationalism. Dickinson is not part of this project yet, but I think she should be, particularly in relation to her practices of copying. Today, I want to get started in thinking about how to include her in this context by approaching her ideas of nation, nationalism, and transnationalism in her work. The goal of my larger project is to think about a group of writers who haven't typically been thought of in terms of literary nationalism under this rubric. And while I think Dickinson is interesting in this regard, I'm also hesitant about painting her as sort of singularly focused on these issues in her work. So just sort of a coda before I begin. One of my entries into Dickinson's ideas on nation is Thomas Wentworth Higginson, whose ardent New England brand of literary nationalism embraced an ideal of an American literature that was, as he wrote in 1870, quote, pervaded with Americanisms, unquote, by which he meant democratic principles, and a recognition that, quote, broad Anglo-Saxon manhood is the basis of our national life, unquote. The sentiment, or a slightly more subtle form of it, also pervades Higginson's 1862 letter to a young contributor, the Atlantic article that famously initiated Dickinson's long correspondence with the editor. I quote from the middle of this piece, and this is the quote on the slide. The mixture of nationalities is constantly coining and exchanging new felicities of dialect. Ireland, Scotland, Germany, and Africa are present everywhere with their various contributions of wit and shrewdness, thought and geniality. In New York and elsewhere, one finds whole thoroughfares of France, Italy, Spain, Portugal. On our Western railways, there are placards printed in Swedish. Even China is creeping in. Thus, the American writer finds himself among his phrases like an American sea captain among his crew, a medley of all nations, waiting for the strong organizing New England mind to mold them into a unit of force. This Krevkrian pain to the American melting pot, with its grounding of American exceptionalism in the molding of immigrant tribes, is striking, I think, because Higginson's influence on Dickinson is so often read in relation to his advocacy for a direct, unembroidered style. But this passage and others in this essay make clear that the particularities of this style, what Higginson calls Americanisms, are very clearly indebted to a transnational vision of the continent. And this vision, I will suggest in this paper, is one that shows resonance in Dickinson's work. The American language, as Higginson defines it, is both nationalist and transnational, built up by both its multinational parts and the force of the New England mind that fuses them. I would like to venture in this paper that Higginson's idea of America as a, quote, medley of all nations, unquote, and other literary nationalist perspectives on the continent infuse Dickinson's language of the nation and the global. Scholars have shown increasing interest in Dickinson's global points of reference since the so-called transnational turn in American studies. And I see in many of Dickinson's transnational poems what Paul Giles compellingly calls her antipodality, her ability to place side by side in one work diametrically opposed points on the globe. This juxtaposition, he writes, quote, serves to reinscribe New England within a global circuit, unquote, decentering and flattening spatial hierarchies, and using the transnational medley, in Giles's words, quote, not as a means of expansion, but as a means of compression, unquote. This radically planetary perspective, though, which Giles attributes in part to Dickinson's interest in contemporary astronomy and geological sciences, is also a perspective that we can see in Higginson's much more conventionally termed framework of America as an amalgam of nations. In this paper, I examine a number of poems that fit Giles's framework of conflating the local and the global onto one horizon, but I do so with Dickinson's nationalist vision of a, quote, strong, organizing New England writer in the back of my mind. Dickinson's planetary verse, I suggest, is both provincial and transnationalist, but is also, I would argue, haunted by the specter of the nation. The Civil War and the Language of the War is one entry into thinking about Dickinson's approaches to nation. If Higginson's letter to a young contributor is a clear relic of an era of literary nationalism, an era of divisions, consolidations, and canonizations, it also, of course, was written during another kind of nationalist disruption and consolidation. This exchange, and also Dickinson's famous peak in poetic output, took place in the middle of the most brutal years of the Civil War, a period that affected New England minds with the hope of a very different type of union, though one that was likely situated firmly in ideals of manifest destiny and American exceptionalism. Higginson himself is an ardent abolitionist who was to become a colonel in the first federally authorized Black regiment in the Civil War, undoubtedly also had this other form of molding on his mind when he wrote his letter. And as Shira Wolowski, Faith Barrett, Eliza Richards, and others have demonstrated, both the town of Amherst and Dickinson herself were immersed in the day-to-day realities of the war, from its political theater to its military battles. I think, though, that critics have made a convincing case for Dickinson's resistance to this particular mode of nationalist rhetoric. Michelle Collar has looked at a subset of Dickinson's poetry from the Civil War years to argue that she resists the Union's traditional teleology and nationalism. Looking at poems that center on the term revolution, Collar shows that Dickinson uses this term to undermine its Civil War era associations with progress and manifest destiny, punning on the idea of planetary revolution and cyclical change. The substitution, in this case, of the national language for the global is one of the ways that we can see Dickinson as participating in what Renée Bergland frames as Dickinson's planetary poetics, a mode that is invested in global interconnections rather than definitions of nationhood. And yet, Dickinson does use clear markers of nationhood and the local American environment in her poetry. What I'm interested in here is how we can think of the global and the national at work simultaneously. One answer is to see these markers of nation as examples of place-based environmentalism that see the universal in the local in the style of Thoreau. And this environmental nationalism is closely tied into the kind of literary nationalist gestures that Higginson makes in his Atlantic letter. For example, in her reading of the Robbins criterion for tune, reproduced here on the slide, Christine Gerhardt writes, quote, "From such a New England perspective, the speaker is able to discern transatlantic patterns of relating to nature and place, suggesting a kind of global regionalism that is nonetheless based upon living intently in one natural cultural situation," unquote. The speaker's allegiance to regional familiars such as the robin, the buttercup, and the daisy in this poem, and her assertion to, quote, see New Englandly, unquote, leads her to a comparison to British perspective and an understanding of both modes of sight as arbitrary and provincial, but nonetheless grounded in necessity. The move from the regional to the global had, as Gerard shows, grounds in contemporaneous environmental politics and writings, but it also demonstrates the ways that environmental regionalism and cultural regionalism were deeply entwined. If the robin, as Elizabeth Petrino notes, presents a regional version of the 19th century trope of the birdsong as female poetic voice, this stress on the local song resonates with an era that featured the consolidation of the regional poetic voice in literary nationalist anthologies such as Rufus Griswold's The Female Poets of America and Gems of the American Poets, the latter of which was in Dickinson's family library. So in other words, I would argue here that Dickinson's New England Robin can be seen not just in relation to the Queen of England, but as one of the voices that make a national anthology of verse. We can see the same sort of regional nationalism in lesser-known poems, such as How the Old Mountains Drip with Sunset and The Trees Like Tassels Hid and Swung. Both of these works are landscape poems that engage in the tradition of the paragone or interarts competition. Both poems draw out an extended poetic description of a landscape that they culminate in comparing to inferior painterly descriptions. They are both poems in a very explicit sense about what language can do that the image cannot, emphasizing temporal progression, sound, smell, and the description of the unseen divinity that hides behind the physical landscape. The Trees Like Tassels concludes its extended description of a dynamic meadow with these lines. And this is on the slide, the last stanza on the slide. "'Twas more I cannot mention, how mean to those that see Van Dyck's delineation of nature's summer day." The speaker's own excess, the preceding stanzas of drawn-out description, and the promise in this first line of more is contrasted to the spareness of the painter's work, a mere delineation or outline of the colorful sensory experience of the previous 6 stanzas. The poem then contrasts physical with spiritual sight and painterly with poetic language. Van Dyck may, in some sense, represent, as Judith Farr writes, quote, all painters. But he also represents one particular artist, a painter of aristocratic secular portraits whose work is contrasted to the depopulated Edenic landscape of Dickinson's poem, a piece that features both a snake and an orchard, an American Eden before the fall. These markers of nation and art likewise form a central part of How the Old Mountains Drip with Sunset, a poem that, like The Trees Like Tassels, documents temporal progression in a landscape that is clearly marked as American. The scene that Dickinson documents carries, like the Robin's criterion for tune, distinct signifiers of the American natural setting, from hemlock to fern to flamingo. The village backdrop, with its church steeples, quiet streets, and glimmering street lamps, has the feel of a small New England town, while the sunset itself calls to mind the paintings of the Hudson River Valley School, whose northeast sunsets made the image a staple of the mid-19th century visual imagination. But what the descriptors emphasize more than anything is age. The mountains and the steeples are old, the sun is wizard, and the dunbrake is that most ancient of plants, the fern. That the scene, then, is not just American, but ancient, seems in line with the era's nationalist efforts at recovering an American past that can rival Europe's. The charge of this landscape, then, invites particular readings of the poem's striking final stanza, and this is on the slide. These are the visions flitted Guido, Titian never told. Domenichino dropped his pencil, paralyzed with gold. The failure of these Italian Renaissance painters to record the landscape stands in contrast not only to the successful and progressive poetic image that the speaker has built up in the course of the last 5 stanzas, but that of the American painters with whom the scene resonates, the Hudson River School. So in other words, what results by this final stanza is a sort of Russian doll layering of imagery, with the speaker's voice as the outside layer, the Hudson River scene as the core of the poem, and the Italian painters as the final kernel. The painters become subsumed not only in the speaker's poem, but in the Hudson River Valley scene. The adjective flitted in the first line modifies both visions and Guido, while Domenichino is paralyzed in the scene that he fails to arrest. The painting that I always think of in relation to this poem is Asher Durand's 1849 Kindred Spirits, which depicts the poet William Cullen Bryant and the painter Thomas Cole in the Catskill Mountains. The painting, completed the year after Cole's death, shows the two artists in front of the Catskill Falls that they had both taken as the subject of their own artworks, a kind of conceptual reversal of the freezing of the three painters in Dickinson's poem in front of the scene that they failed to depict. But Bryant and Cole ghost Dickinson's landscapes, this one and others, even more directly. There is, for instance, Bryant's 1829 Sonnet to an American painter departing for Europe, written in advance of Cole's travels to England and Italy, and dog-eared in the Dickinson family's edition of Bryant's verse. And it's reproduced here on the slide. The poem functions as an admonition to the painter to remember his American home, contrasting the depopulated and, quote, boundless American landscape with the setting of Europe, which bears, quote, everywhere the trace of men, unquote. Where America in this poem is marked by its wildlife and, quote unquote, lone lakes, Europe, even in the quote, fiery alpine air, unquote, is characterized by human history, revealing everywhere its, quote, paths, homes, graves, ruins, unquote. In counseling Cole to, quote, keep that earlier, wilder image bright, unquote, Bryant's poem, much like Cole's own vast and uninhabited landscapes, asserts a nationalist ethos that celebrates the very lack for which America was so often criticized from a cultural and literary perspective. And like how the old mountains drip with sunset, it locates the American setting as the original and the primal, the, quote, earlier, wilder image that the landscapes of Europe threatened to displace. In other words, we can think of Dickinson's vast open landscapes through the lens of global universalism. But Bryant's nationalist framework is also always in the background. And while that is true perhaps particularly for these last two poems that very explicitly contrast American and European modes of representation, I would argue that it's something that we can see in many of Dickinson's depopulated landscapes themselves. In fact, as for Bryant, the American landscape for Dickinson stands in direct contrast to the European, or even the foreign more generally, in its ability to withstand the full force of culture. While foreign place names often function in Dickinson's poetry as adjectives loaded with cultural associations, our lives are Swiss is the most obvious example, markers of Americanness are tied almost exclusively to the natural landscape. Dickinson's use of American place names is rare, but I want to end on a striking poem that calls into play the continent as a whole. And it's reproduced here on the slide. I've known a heaven like a tent to wrap its shining yards, pluck up its stakes and disappear without the sound of boards or rip of nail or carpenter, but just the miles of stair that signalize the show's retreat in North America. No trace, no figment of the thing that dazzled yesterday, no ring, no marvel, men and feats dissolved as utterly as birds' far navigation discloses just a hue, a plash of ore, a gaiety, then swallowed up of view. Michel Kohler writes about this poem beautifully in terms of 19th century theories of literary vision, but all I see when I look at this is Bryant's wilder image of the depopulated American landscape. We have in this poem these very explicit markers of culture, the circus tent most obviously, that gets swallowed up in the landscape. It's flimsy to begin with, built without even boards or nails, but it becomes even more so when we realize that it exists only as a metaphor for the sunset. This expanse, one could say, is Dickinson's perverse answer to Higginson's call for a, quote, strong organizing New England mind, her own effort to unify. But where Higginson sees the wrangling of American voices as the real work, the sea captain's assertion of power over his unwieldy crew, Dickinson locates it as a natural inevitability. We may wish to be dazzled by men and feats, but in the end, all that remains is an absence, nature swallowing up the actions of men and birds in a setting that is and always has been whole without them. We could see that, of course, as an anti-nationalist or at least pre-nationalist vision, and I think in some ways it is. But inflected with perspectives on the American landscape, such as Bryant's, it also is the depopulation that makes Higginson's international medley possible, the myth of the stripped landscape that allows for new waves of Euro-American westward expansion. So where does this leave us? For me, it just provides evidence that Dickinson was thinking of the global, the idea of planetary revolution, at the same time that she was acutely conscious of national and nationalist conversations. And one of the useful things that this provides us, I think, is the ability to think of her writing practices, her variants, her multiple copies, and her fascicles in terms of the ideas of originality, replication, and derivation that were circulating in nationalist circles at this time. It also offers a sort of case study for thinking of nationalism not as its own hermetically sealed space, but as part of a global conversation. Thanks.